In the following interview, Phil Flakes, co-founder of Succession Link, interviews Vance Barse from Manning Wealth Management. Hear about their experience using Succession Link's platform to facilitate the acquisition of $65 million in assets under management.
Congratulations, Vance, on the acquisition of a practice through Succession Link.
Thank you very much, Phil.
I know that we got a chance to talk offline, and you had mentioned that you made a transition from being an investment wholesaler to a producing financial advisor. I guess, what did that transition look like for you?
That's a great question. I joined an institutional alternative investment firm back in 2007, just prior to the beginning of the Great Recession. And in the roughly decade that I spent wholesaling to all intermediaries, wholesaling as a career changed. In my opinion, it used to be a very fulfilling combination of part art and part science. And over time, it just seems like when you meet and exceed your sales goals, you are rewarded by having a smaller territory and smaller budget and smaller compensation. And that just didn't seem to be winning end of that trade. So I decided that I wanted to make more of an impact by leveraging my background and expertise and serve individuals and families, specifically in what I call bridging the gap. And that is the gap that exists in our industry between the investment world and the tax world, if you will.
Got it. Okay. So then how did you narrow down and pick the place where you ultimately wanted to be a producing advisor?
With the exposure that I had as a regional director to home offices and multiple intermediaries, I gained a lot of familiarity with firms and their cultures, the products and services that they have available, the products and services that they don't have available. And I ended up deciding to join Commonwealth Financial Network for the following reasons, really in no order of importance. Number one, the firm culture is a very advisor-friendly culture. Number two, the breadth and depth of their research department. Number three, the advanced planning team that Commonwealth Financial Network offers is truly fantastic and is able to provide me with the resources necessary to make a very positive impact for high net worth individuals and families, and for the familiarity I have with the home office individuals and a number of people in management. It was just a good fit. And over the decade that I spent traveling around the country, consulting financial advisors at wirehouses such as Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley, UBS, independent broker-dealers such as LPL, Commonwealth, Cambridge, Raymond James, and then the independent registered investment advisors and family offices, I developed deep familiarity with those firms. And ultimately, Commonwealth just seemed to be the best fit, and I couldn't be happier.
Glad to hear it. And from my limited experience working with Commonwealth back from my wholesaling days, I remember there's no shortage of good people over there.
So you completely understand the transition that I made.
Certainly do. Yeah. So prior to starting StarPoint, I would echo every sentiment that you just had in terms of having exposure to multiple firms and intermediaries and just seeing the landscape. You really get a good understanding of, what firms are good, what firms are bad, and what firms are, somewhere in between.
You know what, Phil, I did want to point one thing out as it relates to my decision to partner with Commonwealth. One of the things I didn't want to feel was as if I was a cog in the wheel in the machine. And Commonwealth is a great sized broker dealer where it's large enough to be a significant entity in the intermediary space, but it's also small and selective enough where I have access to management, I have access to research, and I have access to advanced planning and other individuals in the home office. And that helps me serve my clients better.
Makes sense. Certainly makes sense. When and how did Succession Link come into the picture or into your world?
I was introduced to Succession Link through a former colleague who ran key accounts at the institutional alternative investment firm that I was with. He actually was in San Diego and we were having dinner, and he asked me what I was doing the following evening. And I asked why, and he explained that Succession Link, your firm, was hosting a dinner. And I asked him what Succession Link is as a firm, and he explained that in a nutshell, it's a platform that helps facilitate the buying and selling of financial advisory practices. And I clicked on the link and saw that there were tickets available, and I just said, you know what, I'll buy my ticket tomorrow. I got to my office the following day, buy the ticket for the dinner. The dinner had actually closed, and I shared with him that it was at capacity and that I really didn't want to show up and beg for forgiveness for attendance. And he insisted that it would be okay if I attended the dinner. And when I showed up, I was very welcomed by your colleagues. And when I walked into the room where the presentation was hosted, I was introduced to an advisor who at the time had only thought about a potential sale. And that's how I came to learn about Succession Link. And that's actually where I met the advisor from whom I acquired the practice.
Gotcha. Okay. And so you met the eventual seller at the dinner. I guess, where did things go from initial meeting to eventual sale of the practice?
We spent roughly 45 minutes getting acquainted. And in particular, he was asking about my background as a regional director and why I had transitioned into the client-facing role. And at the end of the dinner, I remember saying, you know, we should really continue our dialogue. And he shook my hand and he said, best of luck to you. And I wasn't exactly sure what that meant. So the following day, I called him. 2 days later, he came into the office. It was really interesting, Phil, because he explained that he had an interest in selling and he was not looking to sell immediately, but he was really starting his due diligence process for the most appropriate successor to his firm. And he shared with me that he has had multiple decades of relationships with these people. And so it wasn't just the sale of a business. This was the transition of his legacy and very privileged relationships that he has had for a long time. And he was very transparent in sharing that he was simply starting his due diligence process, and that's why he had come into the office. So at the end of that meeting, he said, well, thank you very much. I'm aware of who you are and what you do, and when I'm ready to sell, I might be in touch. So I spent roughly 3 months in limbo, not really sure what was going to happen and if he was going to end up selling or if he had interviewed 30 other financial advisors in the San Diego area or an unknown number of advisors outside of San Diego. I simply didn't know. And on St. Patrick's Day, I received a call and he said, you know, I've interviewed a number of other advisors and you are my first selection. So if you're still interested in engaging into transition, I would like to continue the dialogue. So it was essentially a 3-month time frame between introduction to when we entered into our contractual agreement.
And so how many interactions would you say took place in that first 3 months?
He and I had 4 phone calls and 1 in-person meeting after we met at the Succession Link dinner, which was fantastic, by the way, which was in January of 2017.
Okay. Did that advisor shed any light on how you ended up at the top of the list?
He did, and it actually caught me somewhat by surprise. He shared with me that when he arrived at the office and he brought his practice metrics, for example, number of households, assets under management, which were 65 million, and so on and so forth. We touched on that briefly, but most of my questions for him, Phil, were more about the relationships that he has had, because this advisor had been in practice for 55 years, and he's just a great guy, and he has tremendous relationships that have been very long-term with his clients. And so what I wanted to make sure we did was have a mutual alignment of interests insofar as the contractual agreement and transition is concerned, but also I wanted to maintain his legacy. When you serve multi-generational families for 5+ decades, those are great relationships. And I wanted to make sure that I established and nurtured those same relationships. So he said, you were the only one who didn't jump right into a deep dive in the metrics and focused more on the qualitative aspects of my practice and the families whom I have served. And secondarily, I kind of like that you used to travel the country and advise financial advisors because I think there's a lot of value that can be brought to my clients.
That is certainly great to hear. And as many conversations as we have with the selling advisors, they always tell us, and we relay it to our audience, that it's usually more about the who than it is about the how much. So
Couldn't agree more, Phil. There is no shortage of buyers in this market. And everyone says that they want to buy a practice, but there is a difference between wanting to buy a practice and being a qualified buyer. And this is one of the things that the seller and I talked about. You need to have the assets available for an acquisition and or the loan. And there have been 3 advisors over the last couple of years that I have known for essentially the last decade that have told me their potential deal fell through in the 11th hour because the potential acquirer could not get funding and was not ultimately a qualified buyer.
got it. So sounds like a lot of time, I don't want to say wasted, but a lot of time invested to get to final stages and find out the money isn't there.
Yeah, it would just be disappointing because both parties start to develop expectations of a deal and then it falls through.
Mm-hmm. And so, Vance, I also heard you mention that the selling advisor found value in the fact that you had been a regional director and there was some travel involved. I know leading up to the interview, you had mentioned that some pretty interesting statistics about where the clients were actually located. Could you shed some light on that?
Well, I live in America's finest city, which for those who aren't familiar with that phraseology is sunny. San Diego, California. I only have 3 clients in San Diego, and the overwhelming corpus of relationships that I have are not only outside of San Diego, but they're outside of California. One of the potential concerns that I had in acquiring this retiring advisor's practice is that because of the race to the bottom in fees in our industry, and because of the over commoditization of portfolio management, it might be difficult for me to present my value proposition to families that are so far away. So I took it upon myself, Phil, to hop on planes and go visit them in Connecticut and New York and Texas and a number of other cities, simply to meet them in person, look them in the eyes, shake their hands, and ask them about their families, what their passions are, what they've really enjoyed about the long-term relationship that they had with the selling advisor. And if there's anything that on a wish list they could have, I can provide moving forward so that their overall wealth management experience can be as impactful and robust as possible. And in those conversations, I outlined that they were very versed in portfolio management because the advisor had done an excellent job at asset management. And a number of these individuals or families started to say, my tax burden is high, or, I really have a deep passion about the Boys and Girls Club or 4-H or my local church. And that's where the door to advanced planning conversations around estate planning, tax planning, and charitable giving and so forth really were opened. And that, I think, is when a lot of these clients realize the services that I offer are much more robust than quote unquote portfolio management. And through the dialogue that we had, the relationship was initiated. And then over time, and it's been almost a year now, the relationships have been solidified. So I am very happy to report that we have had 100% transition and retention, except for one client who unfortunately passed away due to age.
That is an impressive statistic to know that percentage of the book transferred.
Yeah, it was interesting because when we were talking about the transition, the geographical difference was a concern that the selling advisor had. Said, you're not local to these clients, and I like that because I haven't been having quarterly reviews in my office, for example. But it's also a concern because, in many cases, they are entirely across the country. But I found that if you build rapport and you show value and you develop and nurture that relationship, particularly with modern technology, it's not difficult to maintain a very healthy and strong relationship. and it just simply has not been an issue.
Makes sense. And so you mentioned that you were, getting on planes, going out and meeting these clients. Oftentimes we hear that the initial meetings are joint meetings with the selling advisor. Was that your experience, or were your meetings you going out there solo?
I was attending and hosting those meetings solo. The selling advisor was not able to travel to that many cities in that amount of time. And that was another potential concern that I had, which was they're used to this advisor for a number of years, and then I show up. So not only am I a different person, I'm younger than the selling advisor, and he's not there to sit alongside of me to make that introduction. And he had a really high level of confidence in my ability to host these meetings individually. And he shared with me that he has shared with his clients, Phil, that he conducted months of due diligence, and actually his due diligence process in looking for a successor started before he attended the Succession Link dinner. So he had already spent, I think it was 4 months prior to that dinner, in consulting with potential suitors for the business. But nonetheless, I hosted the meetings individually. They all went very well, and the seller and the clients have been very happy.
Good. Okay. And so what were the terms of the deal?
We wanted to establish a mutual alignment of interest, as I shared earlier, so that both of us were motivated to work alongside of one another in each other's best interest as we upheld the best interest of the client. And when you have transition from a fee-based practice to another fee-based practice, that conversion ostensibly is pretty simple in terms of the metrics you use for valuation and implementation of the acquisition. If you have a brokerage or commission-based practice and transition to a brokerage or commission-based practice, ostensibly that is somewhat of an easy transition when you look at metrics and implementation and so forth. If you recall, at the time, this is early last year, the Department of Labor rule was all we heard about. Every investment news issue, every article that came out from FA Magazine and so forth was all about the implementation of the Department of Labor rule. And like many broker-dealers, my broker-dealer was going to disallow commission-based transactions in retirement accounts. So this put us in a bit of a dilemma in that in the acquisition, we had to not only introduce me and make the transition, but we also had to introduce a new type of service model, which evolved away from the conventional commission-based model and incorporated a flat fee or flat percentage cost model for qualified assets. But when I went and met with clients, we explained independently of one another that we had to make this transition because of the Department of Labor ruling, and everything went very well. So in terms of the dollars and cents of the deal, we decided that we would have a 15% down payment and then 2 look-back provisions. So he had his asking price for the book, which, by the way, I would like to thank Succession Link for their practice valuation tool, because that was very helpful in determining the appropriate valuation for his practice. I trust that you have received very similar feedback from other advisors in the past.
Thank you. And interesting.
Pardon, go ahead.
I know, just simply saying thank you. And interestingly enough, yeah, we certainly have heard that more than anything else, it helps set expectations on both sides.
And just to expand on the terms of the deal, he, like many sellers, had said, I just want to have a one and done. And I explained the problem with that, or the potential problem, is that I, as a buyer, then acquire flight risk from the clients. So I want to make sure that you and I are both financially incentivized, in addition to the moral implications of it, of course, to work alongside of one another so that we have 100% transition and retention. And normally I think it's about an 85% retention. Is that correct?
It is. Yep. 85 to about 90%.
So we had multiple variables here. We had the geographical issue. We had the firm transition, because a lot of sellers don't want to leave their firm. And in this case, this seller, Phil, had made a transition 18 months before. And that was a concern for him. And I explained, I'm very highly confident that when I meet with these clients, I can explain that this is a final transition as part of your transition into retirement, and that the transition that happened, I think I just used the word transition 3 times in 2 sentences. Sorry about that. But nonetheless, he had to switch broker dealers 18 months before because the broker dealer where he resided ended up consolidating or getting sold, I can't remember, to another broker dealer. So again, the geographical issue, the second transition in under 2 years issue, we had the Department of Labor ruling issue, and there were just a number of factors that were evolving at the same time. So that's why we did the 2 look-back provisions, so that with the 15% down, I could show good faith and interest in acquiring the business. And then the first look-back provision was 90 days after we inked our deal. And it only took about a month and a half for the bulk of those clients to transition over. And then the second look-back provision was roughly a year after we inked the deal. But to answer your question succinctly, the terms at a high level were 15% down, 2 look-back provisions. The first look-back provision was such that if we look at the total asking price for the book, I'd say, okay, well, let's divide it in 2 so that you get half of it at the first look-back provision, and then you get the other half at the end so that you're available to answer any client questions or concerns over the next year, right?
Makes sense.
And that was it. So, I've done research and seen how fee-based firms are sold, and they might want a 2X, for example, and you do 50% down, and then there's a multi-year earnout or some variation thereof. There was no real model that we could reference for the number of variables that I just discussed.
Mm-hmm. And so how did negotiations go? I mean, obviously, in hindsight, it seems easier to kind of recount what happened, what the deal terms were, and, perfect, we agreed to them. But while you were in it, did you uncover all of these challenges all at once? Or was it over time that you understood more about the practice? And what did the negotiation look like in terms of figuring out those deal terms?
The negotiation was a process, Phil, that I thought was going to be not necessarily volatile, but uncomfortable, because you both want ultimately the same thing, which is the transfer of the business. The seller wants maximum profit. The buyer wants maximum value. And somewhere in between is where you have to meet. And we just simply had very open, casual dialogue in terms of what the concerns were. And the concern that I had is the same concern that arguably most buyers have, and that is flight risk. And the seller was very highly confident that the clients that he has served for these years and years and years would simply follow his recommendation. And that ended up being the case. And we're both very happy with that.
So would you say that was your maybe biggest surprise throughout the process?
That's a great question, Phil. My biggest surprise, looking back at the multi-month transition, really didn't have anything to do with the practice itself. And it had everything to do with the following conversation I had with the advisor, which was very short. He called me and he said, I really wish I had done this 10 years ago. And I asked him why. And he said, I am having the time of my life. I am playing tennis. I am playing golf. I am enjoying my time at the beach. And while I had a wonderful time the last 10 years doing what I have done professionally, I just simply wish I had an extra decade of doing it. And for whatever reason, that made me smile, because it gives me something to look forward to, and hopefully I can have that conversation someday.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I could say, why am I telling this to you? Here's why. I've done my due diligence on you. You're very highly qualified. And you know what? I don't want to work an extra 10 years than I have to. So here you go. And in the end, when a seller transitions the practice to the buyer, it's not goodbye forever. And it's not the cessation of the relationships that the seller has had. If you've been serving an individual or a family for multiple decades, that's a lifelong relationship in most cases. And there's no reason that a liquidation of the business or a transfer of the practice, if you will, means that relationship has to end.
Mm-hmm. Just takes a new shape, right?
Yeah, I did just find it quite surprising that he called and said that. And that will never be lost on me.
That's great. If I could maybe shift gears and ask you, what piece of advice would you give to other advisors, whether they're prospective or current members of the Succession Link community, but what piece of advice would you give them?
For buyers, sellers, or both?
Both if you have it.
Yeah, for sellers, this is your legacy. This is the entity that you have created through years of hard work and dedication and service, and in many cases, sacrifice away from time with family and so forth. And when finding an appropriate buyer, ask yourself, do I want to sell to the super mega huge RIA that has double-digit billions and is all across the country and has thousands and thousands of accounts? Because if that's been your service model, then that's likely a good fit. If you're a solo practitioner, would it make more sense to have someone that has that personal touch and is going to be able to receive the baton that you pass to the buyer and continue those relationships in the service model that you have built? And when we look at selling a practice, especially in this market, there's no shortage of buyers, as I mentioned earlier. Phil, I think the statistic is there are roughly 40 buyers for every seller. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yep.
So some smaller number than 40 is the number of qualified buyers. So we start with that pool. It's not about getting your asking price for the practice. You'll find a buyer. The question is appropriate fit, and the only way you'll be able to determine if it's an appropriate fit is through dialogue and spending time with potential acquirers. For buyers, the market is saturated with buyers. I think it's a fair assessment to say that it's saturated if there are 40 potential buyers for every one seller. I found using Succession Link to be a very useful exercise because I am able to email sellers. And for potential buyers, my suggestion would be to include what makes you different and unique from the rest of the advisors that might be contacting the selling advisor regarding their practice.
That's certainly great advice. All right. Well, Vance, if there are current or prospective members of Succession Link looking to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to do that?
You know what, Phil? My experience with Succession Link has been so positive and rewarding that I am more than happy to serve as a sounding board or educational resource for other Succession Link members. They can either email me or call me on my cell phone. My email address is Vance, VANCE, at Manning, MANNING, WM.com. That's Vance at ManningWM.com. Or the good old-fashioned way, they can call me on my cell phone. That number is 760-519-5871. Again, 760-519-5871. I'm more than happy to answer any general questions that they have, or just simply provide feedback on how my experience went in using Succession Link.
Well, thank you, Vance, and I certainly sincerely appreciate that. Congrats again on the successful acquisition. Any parting thoughts?
The industry is under a pretty intense evolution with the Department of Labor ruling, the consolidation of firms, and the commoditization of portfolio management and investments in general. This is a dynamic time for practitioners like us, and it's a really unique opportunity for us to show value to our clients outside of basic portfolio management. And one of the things I have deeply valued in my engagements through Succession Link is that advisors understand the importance of the value proposition of advanced and comprehensive financial planning. And as I shared earlier, if anyone has any questions about a potential deal, they're more than welcome to give me a call.
Great. All right. Well, thanks again, Vance, for joining and sharing your experience. And congrats again on the successful acquisition.
Thank you very much, Bill. I sincerely appreciate it.